chat or a Q&A, either to the speakers or to any of the logistics. And with that, I'll hand it over to Asta.
Thanks, Andy, and the UNDP team for inviting me to this panel. I'm particularly excited because I've learned so much from the work of my fellow panelists, particularly Sylvie's work on bottom-up data trust has really helped frame so much of my thinking on this question. I think some of this was discussed yesterday as well, but I think we need to locate what's happening in this broader trend of quote-unquote alternative data governance. I don't necessarily like that framing because this assumes that mainstream data governance is the way to go, and then there are some alternatives in the way that alternative medicine, etc., comes up. But we will come back to the vocabulary because I think all of us working in this field spend a lot of time talking about vocabulary. But I think there's an increasing realization that data governance, which is broadly, laws about how data is collected, processed, and used, why we're talking about it is because I think there's a realization increasingly that data is actually a certain form of capital accumulation, and in the way that it's done is that it's extractive. It is something that it's deliberate in the sense that companies, technology platforms capture it from different sources, and the mechanisms of governance and also builds into the business models of a lot of technology platforms. The problem with all of this datafication is that what it does is that there's an atomization of individuals that happens, and what it ignores in the current forms of governance is that data is actually a relational good. Collection about me impacts people who are like me, and similarly groups that I may or may not be part of, but data about them will also impact how I am perceived and not perceived. Similarly, the representation of data is critical, and there's also a lot of inequality that comes up because of the way data is produced, the way data is used. All of that needs to be thought of. So, all of this to say that individuals as a unit of analysis for data governance is increasingly becoming a bit strained, even though all our data governance policies and regulations, whether it's the GDPR in Europe or our the personal data protection bill in India and elsewhere, are all looking at individual control over data. And it's not even control as much as individual governance, which is focused on giving people information and then asking people to take action through mechanisms of consent based on that information. So that's one part of the problem, is that we are unable to quote unquote control how our data is collected, used, and processed. So the role of the individual in this process of data governance is something that is being reimagined. The second thing that's also happening simultaneously is that we need to think about how data is being used and what the purpose of that usage is data being used to empower people, communities that are producing it, or is it being used for private profit purposes? And I think the answer is the latter. Also, the other thing is that data is siloed, it's underused, and we don't necessarily draw value from it in the way that it should be. If it is indeed a resource that we are all producing, then it should be used for our benefit. Now, so it's a two-pronged problem. There's misuse and mismanagement, and underuse on the other end. And that's where data stewardship comes in. And we define data stewardship as the ability to unlock the value of data across stakeholders while safeguarding rights, while giving people this ability to be part of the decision-making process in data governance across its use, processing, collection, etc. And in our minds, data stewardship can be used in different ways. The first is, of course, to empower individuals to control their data, to decide who gets to use it and who doesn't get to use it, who gets to access it, and how that access is determined. The second is for community or collective bargaining, which is that a group or a community of people can come together, and we're seeing examples of this in different sort of ways, including with platform workers, where people can come together, coalesce around questions of data rights, and collectively bargain, whether it's through pooling their data rights in certain ways. And then the final final one is societal benefit, where, certain kinds of data can be unlocked for a broader societal purpose. We've been seeing this in the context of, COVID-19, where a lot of data sharing has happened between practitioners and health providers, etc., and has enabled this crisis to be addressed in a timely, efficient manner. Of course, there are ethical issues that have also emerged as a result of that, but we think that that's the third purpose for why stewardship is important. So like I said, the entire purpose of all of this is to give people a seat at the table when it comes to their data governance, and also decide what data is going to be used, and in a way that value is unlocked. And a lot of different models are coming up in this context across these three buckets. So for instance, you have personal data stores that are coming up. So there's, DigiMe, which allows you to aggregate your data in different ways. And then attached to that are questions of, should people be allowed to monetize it? But it does, as a starting point, give you control over your data. The second, like I mentioned, are these collective bargaining mechanisms. So there's Driver's Seat, which is a data cooperative based out of San Francisco that allows drivers to, create data on their journeys on Uber or Lyft or Grab, whatever they're using, and gives them a certain degree of transparency about how their data is being used, and also allows them to compare things like, oh, driver A made $10 on this journey versus driver B that made $12 on the same journey. So it gives them a certain degree of transparency on how their data is being used in a certain way, and also allows them to come together on questions of data. So this cooperative can then exchange information. And while it's a new project, I think the overall imagination is to, over time, get into spaces of collective bargaining with platforms on questions of data, because we're increasingly seeing that, the realization that platforms use data in an exploitative, opaque manner is impacting platform workers. And then finally, the societal sharing in India. Again, we see this in some ways. A platform called the Indian Urban Data Exchange has been built, which allows cities to share aggregated, anonymized data in secure, partnerships with other data requesters. So whether it's apps that are trying to solve traffic issues or women's safety, can liaise with the city directly on this platform to share data. So those are some of the ways in which we're seeing these models come up. Now, the thing about these models is that they are at the moment quite new and quite experimental, and it's a lot of like wait and watch. At least for us at Aapti, we've been trying to study what the different design choices are that models make. What are the different mechanisms for governance? Is cooperative a good mechanism? Is personal data trust, data or personal data stores, or data trust, which we are all looking to learn more about? Like, what are the mechanisms of governance that work and don't work? And I think, and I was saying this to somebody also yesterday, is that we need to start moving out of this theoretical imagination of these mechanisms of data governance and start to think about more real implications. To that end, some work is happening also in the policy sector, which again, along with real world implementation, there has to be regulation and policy around this. So in the context of India, the non-personal data committee report, which came out, one draft came out in August, and I think the other one came out in December, mentions data trustees, which I think is a word that they've just borrowed without fully understanding it, but they think of them as representatives of the will of the community that will liaise with custodians and data acquirers to figure out where and how this data should be used. But I think, and Sylvie will talk about this, but the fiduciary responsibility that is so critical to the imagination of trustees is not necessarily reflected. So I think that even within governments, like in India, and also in some version of the DGA, which is the Data Governance Act out of Europe, also mentions some of these models. There's almost like a certain haste to regulate these models. And I think that that's something that, my personal view is that we need some breathing room to figure out what these models are. We need to do more pilots. We need to figure out where which model works, where are trusts most applicable versus where are cooperatives most applicable. We need to figure those things out. And I think more broadly, we need to think about the ecosystem questions of, are we able to figure out what the capacity that is required? Civil society organizations, what are their roles? Because again, in the context of India, the NPD says that community-based organizations will be trustees. But I mean, anybody who's worked on the ground will know that the capacities of community-based organizations that are, trying to deliver on all of these different questions on the ground, having them work on data governance is an extremely additional burden, which needs to be considered. The second is, and again, I think Kevin brought this up in the discussion, and which is something that we've also been struggling with, is that how do we communicate value of stewardship across stakeholders, whether it's the government, whether it's civil society organizations, whether it's the private sector, or individuals and communities themselves. I think that's really, really critical to articulate, and then also to experiment around that, because there's so much of this like privacy paradox in terms of convenience versus privacy. Will people actually do the additional labor, if at all, of being involved in data governance issues? And then finally, related to that, and this is again something that Christina Cocklow at Weeklock talks about quite a bit, or she designed Weeklock, but is that the capacity of these institutions, like I said, civil society organizations, but unions, for instance, that have to increasingly consider questions of data rights, like how are they able to do that? So I think like a broader ecosystem question also, as we think about implementation of these models, is important. So just to summarize, there's a lot of that's happening and it's all very exciting, but the models are very young and new. So we need to figure out what their impact is on the ground. We need to understand what models work, what governance mechanisms work, and where they don't. We also need to think about sector specific questions. What works for worker rights may not work for health research. And there are different ways to think about these models. And then finally, a question of like a broader ecosystem capacity around data governance, and building out models of data stewardship is critical. So I'll pause there, Andy, hopefully all in time.
Thank you. Yes. Wow. I mean, it was so much content in such a short time. So before I hand it over to Sylvie, let me just summarize a few points quickly. So you didn't only, explain to us sort of what the issue is around the current data economy. It's extractive, it benefits a few, not so much the many. That our data, or our initial data, not just impacts us, but everyone else around us. Collectively, that we are not really able to control so much what happens to our data at the moment. And there's a sort of a dichotomy between sort of misuse and mismanagement of data, at the same time underuse, as you called it. And solutions might be in what we refer to as sort of data stewardship, which is sort of, I think, a broader term for a number of different approaches and models, which is about sort of governing our data. Here, you talked about the value of data stewardship when it comes to empowering people, at the same time, individually, but also collectively as communities. And you mentioned a couple of models such as personal data stores, data cooperatives, data trusts, which is a nice segue to Sylvie, because there's a massive hype, at least in some of the circles here, data governance circles, when it comes to data trusts. Just yesterday, the German government released their data strategy, and data trusts was featured there prominently. The same goes for the European Commission data strategy. So Sylvia, tell us what's all the hype about, what's a data trust, and how do you actually implement it?
Well, thank you, Andy, first for organizing this or putting us together. And Ashta, what a job you've done! It's fantastic. You've covered a lot of ground, and so this helps a lot, actually. And I agree a lot with what you've said. So it's really complementary to what Ashta has been explaining. So I suppose I should start by saying, what is the motivation? I think it really helps to understand where the idea for data trust came from, at least as we discussed it with Neil Lawrence, with whom I developed this. And the idea is really quite simple. It's to take into account the fact that so far, and I think it's still true today, there are really interesting conversations that take place about the need to facilitate better data sharing. Nobody's going to dispute that. Yeah, we are not using data as well as we could. And as a result, there are many important social goods that remain out of reach, simply because we haven't gotten our act together when it comes to sharing data. And that is frankly unacceptable in some ways. I mean, we should wake up and fix this. Probably we don't have time to take too long to do this. So there's concerns about data sharing where we could do a lot better than we currently do. That's one side of the conversation. The other side of the conversation, which is no less important, but too often separated from concerns about data sharing, is the fact that nobody's going to deny either that when we go online, and many people don't even realize it, we leak data on a daily basis, and this leaking of data on a daily basis makes us vulnerable. And it makes us vulnerable in a very particular way. It makes us vulnerable in a way that touches our ability to develop and deploy our sense of self in the long term. So it's a very insidious type of vulnerability, which is too easily ignored and not easily regulated, in the sense that you can't easily pinpoint a harm that can be repaired with compensation. Yeah, so by the time harms have been done, it's too late really to compensate or to fix it. So concerns about data sharing, one, and then concerns about addressing the very insidious types of vulnerabilities that come with the fact that we leak data on a daily basis. So how do we do this? How do we, in other words, how do we bring back together those two important kinds of conversations? Now, that was the concern behind the proposal for data trust. The idea is that if we think a little bit harder about the types of legal frameworks that can facilitate the empowerment of groups on one hand, and on the other hand, a much better, more meaningful way of thinking about consent, then maybe we could bring about types of data sharing infrastructures that actually pull together in one conversation these two concerns, data sharing and protecting from vulnerabilities. And here, of course, we came up, Neil and I, with this notion of data trust a while ago. And this idea of data trust is at bottom, it's not a PR term, yes, it's too often used because data trust sounds good. Yeah, who wouldn't want a data trust? It's great. Yeah, everybody needs more trust, and so you put data and trust together and you have a PR coup. Well, that's unfortunate because actually it has created a bit of an uphill struggle in that, as Ashta said, sometimes we've had to talk a lot too much really, about vocabulary, which is boring. But actually sometimes vocabulary matters. And it matters because we need to know what we're talking about when we talk about data trust. And when we talk about data trust, we talk about a legal structure. It's a legal structure that's made possible by a very particular type of legal framework, which is trust law. Okay. Now, trust law is a very dusty part of, at the origin, it was UK law. Now it has exported itself to more or less all common law countries. And so immediately I hear your questions, you will say, well, what about countries that don't have common law? And I will come back to that. Okay. But so it's a dusty part of law. But what's really interesting about this dusty branch of law is that actually it has adapted remarkably well to emerging novel types of challenges. So today, the challenge at stake is that we have a type of asset, data, that can be used as a kind of commercial asset increasingly, but that's also very intrinsically linked to effectively human rights because of the vulnerabilities at stake. So how do we make sense of an entity, data, that touches upon such different ways of thinking about law and the rights we have, etc. So data trust, what do they do concretely? Well, data trust enable you to bring the rights you have over your data in a legal structure, the data trust, and you bring the rights you have over your data in order to enable the data trustee, who has a fiduciary responsibility to exercise those rights on your behalf. So you enable the data trustee to leverage the power that comes with these aggregated rights to potentially negotiate better terms and conditions with service providers. And I'm going to give you an example, but also to monitor and perhaps create better data sharing agreements. Okay, so let's, I think I'm going to structure the points I still need to make. I just want to check, how many minutes do I have left?
5.
5, perfect. So there are two big things that data trust can enable. One is empower groups. I've mentioned it before, but it's important. I mean, today, much of the legal frameworks are focused on individuals and not groups. Now, data trusts have this way of enabling groups of individuals, whether they know each other or not, to pool together their resources, in this case, data rights, in order to get a voice, yeah, in order to have a say over how their data is used and for what purposes, etc. Now, there's an interesting analogy historically here, and I just want to mention it quickly. At the end of the 19th century, you had such things called land societies. And land societies were created to effectively enable a much wider or much larger number of people to acquire the right to vote. Not many people know this, that at the end of the 19th century, the right to vote in the UK, at least, was conditioned upon having a freehold title to a piece of land. Now, of course, not everybody had a freehold title to a piece of land. So what did they do? They pooled resources, in this case, money, to acquire a big piece of land, which was then cut into pieces. And that meant that instead of having one person having the right to vote, you had potentially, I don't know, 500. Well, with data trust, there's a similar logic at stake. The idea being that at the moment, there are many disenfranchised groups, individuals who have no voice when it comes to important decisions about how data is used and for what purposes. So that's the political dimension of data trust, is that actually it can be an empowering instrument for groups or communities that potentially are marginalized or disenfranchised in the current system. Why? Because it basically enables them to acquire power by aggregating the data rights they have over the data. Now that's for groups. The other important block here, the Lego block, is consent. Yeah. So much of our current legal framework is based on this notion of consent. Are we happy with the notion of consent as it exists? No. Why? Because we have these pop-up windows that come up way too often on our screen asking us if we consent to this, that, or that. And of course, nobody has the time or the ability to meaningfully engage with those questions. So what can data trust do here? Well, by tasking a professional, and I hope I have time to talk about that, but by tasking a data trustee with the exercise of the rights you have over your data, you effectively have a means of reversing the direction of consent. Now, what do I mean by this? I'll give you an example. So let's say when I go and shop on Amazon, yeah, I log in with my normal individual credentials. Well, an alternative in an ideal world would be that I, Sylvie, have signed up to a data trust that has set up some terms and conditions and negotiated with Amazon saying, look, we have, let's be big, let's have 2 billion people in my data trust. Either you play with us and you agree with some terms that govern the use and collection of our data, or I tell the 2 million people in this data trust to go and shop elsewhere, and potentially I exercise the rights to access of those 2 million people and give this data, or at least the data that's accessible, to a competitor. Well, that's going to change the way things are played out today. Okay, so the reversal of the direction of consent is a rather exciting prospect. It's not going to happen overnight, but that's something that data trust can facilitate. Now, I think a lot hangs, and I'm really thankful to Ashta for flagging this up. A lot hangs on how one defines data trustees. Data trustees are not some magic entity that solves all problems. Data trustees have a difficult job. And one of the questions practically is, how do we train enough data trustees? And how do we make sure that they are living up to the responsibilities they have, the fiduciary responsibilities they have? And that's where trust law is fantastic. Why? Because trust law comes in with built-in safeguards, institutional safeguards that are inherent to the legal structure provided by trust law. And that's where data trust will differ from data co-ops. And I'm not against data co-ops, by the way, but I think in contexts where vulnerabilities are high, I do think that data trust provide much stronger institutional safeguards and hence should be favored in context where there is a concern about vulnerability. Data co-ops can do lots of fantastic things, but at the end of the day, they have to rely on either contract or corporate structures. And that doesn't come with the same institutional safeguards. And I should stop here.
Thanks so much, Sylvie, and thanks for reminding us that the hype is real and justified, because indeed, as you outlined, data trust can be a powerful mechanism, but at the same time, as you were saying, everyone loves data, everyone loves trust, and you put that together, and then there's some mischief that some people do with that, maybe. So it's good that you and your colleagues are working on that and addressing that. And thanks so much for also pulling into discussion and highlighting the consent issue and meaningful consent, and what you can actually do about that. Every one of us experience on a daily basis how dreadful that is, to not really have meaningful control over what we consent to and whatnot. No one's reading the 50 pages of the terms of use, as you rightly pointed out. All right, I'll hand it over to Piru. Piru will look at the whole discussion that we're having on data governance, alternative data governance, although Asta doesn't like the term so much, from an Indigenous data sovereignty perspective. And so we're excited to hear what Asta and Sylvie were presenting, discussing, to what extent that applies to also in that space. So Piru, over to you.
Thank you. I'm going to show some slides to facilitate some of this discussion. I'm Prue Chung from the Open Development Initiative, and part of what the Open Development Initiative works on is to empower communities to use data and information to gain rights to land and natural resources and other government services or facilities. And so our main focus has always been on marginalized communities and how we can empower them to use data appropriately for their own advancements. And we've particularly been involved in the concepts of Indigenous data sovereignty within the Asia region. So I want to give some context here on Asia. So the reason why we focused on ethnic minorities, particularly in Asia, is because there's approximately 411 million Indigenous peoples that live across the Asia region. That's a huge amount of people who are essentially disenfranchised from any access to their rights as Indigenous peoples under international laws to self-determine as Indigenous, to be able to access land and natural resources for livelihoods, for maintaining their traditional cultural practices, for governing their communities in ways that is sovereign. And so as a result of this disempowerment and divestment of rights within Asia, you have a situation where ethnic armed conflict is polarizing Asia. And the most classic example of this has to be in Myanmar, where ethnic armed conflict pretty much spans all of the ethnic regions. And is a hugely controversial issue. And much of this is fighting over lands and territories. This escalation of violence then is significant. I'm so sorry about that noise. I didn't realize they were coming today. It really does divest Indigenous peoples to access their basic fundamental human rights. And much of this has to do with the way that national states determine and count people in national census, which makes them fundamentally invisible. And without an ability to self-determine and recognize as Indigenous within national census, you then are not counted within a system. And so national policies or government services that are delivered or decisions are made around policies that affect you are not actually based upon your own agenda. And so we have governing data ecosystems at the moment within Southeast Asia that are extremely colonized in this perspective, because they don't respect Indigenous people's rights to self-determination and manage and govern their own data and data ecosystems. This then leads to data that is inconsistent, inaccurate, and relatively irrelevant to Indigenous people's development. It then externalizes the control and ownership of their data, their sovereign data, into parties that don't necessarily have their interest at hand. And then there's a lot of mistrust and exploitative behavior that comes with this type of externality of data ecosystems here. And that has a lot to do with the way development is implemented here, the way infrastructure and other projects and external investments are implemented here. And then data infrastructure is completely lacking to support alternative models and have the capacity to actually incorporate sovereign models for Indigenous people's data rights. And fundamentally, the most important factor on the deficit is the way this data is then utilized by governments and other institutions to then reflect Indigenous peoples in a deficit lens. And this then undermines their ability to actually advocate for their own advancements within development contexts. So what we're proposing is an Indigenous data sovereign model, which then looks at how do we invest the rights of Indigenous peoples and nations to govern the control and the collection, ownership, and application of their own data. And this is a concept that's been coordinated globally as well as nationally within different sovereign states, including Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and the US. The ODI is now working on a project with the Asian Indigenous Peoples Pact to actually come to an approach of Indigenous data sovereignty within the national countries that we work in, but also at a regional level to implement a framework that can then help to articulate how data governing structures are then moved forward within Asia that include Indigenous voices. And so what does this fundamentally mean and look like? So Indigenous data sovereignty then implies that communities have governance over their data. So if they have access, ownership, and control over their Indigenous data, they're able to then govern their data and make it available to them in a quality that is acceptable to them, that is relevant to them, and that they can access readily. And this speaks to their ability to control the data to exercise their rights. And in doing so, it allows them to then rebuild data about their communities and their institutions that then allows them to then exercise their rights to commence rebuilding their nation. And this is all intrinsically linked to their ability to govern and manage their natural resources, because the main contention here is the conflict between landed territories and the displacement of Indigenous peoples from that land. And data is at the crux of much of this. And so this whole concept of Indigenous data sovereignty, if we put it together and actually able to exercise this within the region and implement it within frameworks of existing data governing structures and policies within Asia, it could fundamentally, if it was accepted, could fundamentally contribute to peace and security within the region. Imagine if you had sovereign Indigenous communities who were able to govern their own data and information about lands and territories. They could exercise their rights to approach investors around natural resource extractions that would then not only benefit their communities on their terms, but then also play a critical role in the national rebuilding of the nation as a country as well. And so you have this ability then of sovereign states within nations to be able to talk to each other and coordinate more appropriate ways to respect traditional values on how to manage natural resources and investments in the country, while still contributing to overall national objectives, which include development to reduce poverty, health, education, climate change, you name it. And if these states could talk together in a peaceful manner that has equal leveraging of power, then it could be transformative for the region. So in conclusion, I think Indigenous data sovereignty addresses the problem of unequal power dynamics and relations that are completely denying the rights to self-determination, identity, capacity, and knowledge sharing within Asia currently. There are also, it also reevaluates these dangerous corporate structures. So when investors come into Asia and Southeast Asia in particular, they're negotiating with state governments that don't necessarily have the interest of Indigenous peoples to hand. And many of these corporations also have safeguards and policies around pre-fight informed consent, ensuring social and environmental safeguards, but are rarely upheld. And so if you have Indigenous peoples that are engaged in these negotiations from the start, you could then really invest in Indigenous leadership in how investments are made across the region. Traditional knowledge systems are being eroded through various ways of extraction. And if we could harness infrastructure to capture Indigenous knowledge that empowers Indigenous communities and understand their ways of knowing, I think that this could then really provide them with a powerful agency to dictate the way certain policies are implemented, not only around data governance, but critical social development issues and climate change issues. And lastly, the point about the influence of these states' sovereign Indigenous sovereignty units that can be able to talk to nation states and negotiate for their own betterment and development. And in doing so, I'm hoping that that would also help to influence policy. And so if Indigenous communities could leverage these types of knowledge into technical systems that accept and that are not only adaptable to their ways of knowing, but actually can be shared and controlled and managed by them independently, decentralized from national systems, which is critically important, then you could see a shift in the dynamics in the way that communities are then being empowered to negotiate certain contracts or investments within the region that are disenfranchising them and displacing them from their land and natural resources. And that's all I had.
Thanks so much, Piero. And thank you for bringing, I think, a very important element of the discussion, which is power and the unequal distribution of power and how that affects entire sort of data ecosystems and the legacy that sort of is inherent in these ecosystems. So thanks so much for that, and sort of and how that leads to a mistrust in current sort of mechanisms and systems. So before we do Q&A and before I hand it over to Afreen, I'd like to get right to the point, which is what Asta said earlier, is we talk about concepts and models and approaches and a bit of an abstract to some extent, but and Asta put it nicely, how do we actually move out from the theoretical sort of space to the real world practical testing? And I know that many of you, if not all of you, not just do research, but also do sort of practical implementation. So, please tell us what we need to do in terms of practically sort of going about this and implementing it. Sylvie, is that a hand up or?
Yes, it's a hand up. Thank you because I felt bad actually. So far we've talked too much about theory, and I thought Piero's presentation was spot on, because actually for me it flags two important things at least. One is, so concretely, what Piero shows also is the data trusts are lovely, but if there are no data rights acknowledged or addressed in a particular system, then how do data trusts help? They might help actually in an indirect way by potentially, you could have, say, big charities or foundations sponsoring a data trust that then enables or is meant to help people in countries where there may not be any data rights framework to nevertheless be in a collectivized structure that grants them power. But then comes the concrete question though. I do think that how do we get from now to a system where there are a variety of data stewardship structures? I think we need more decentralization, that's very clear. And that's where the personal data repositories, I'm not a fan of them for the simple reason that they that they assume too much capacity on the part of each individual user. Yeah, each individual user is supposed to have the time and availability to think about difficult choices on a daily basis. But in a context like Piru was talking about, I do think that actually individual data repositories could play a crucial role. Yeah, in contexts where you have basically vast numbers of people who are disenfranchised, who have no way of negotiating or calling for more power, for more rights, you need to give what's the beginning of empowerment. And the beginning of empowerment might be these individual data repositories. So a phone that you have, if you have a phone, that you then use to effectively change the bargaining direction. Yeah, so if you then in your village start all doing that, you're going to start changing the dynamics potentially. I mean, that's what struck me, Piru. I think your presentation was really important because this is a gap in the practical question of how do we get from today, the mess we're in, to a situation that's better. And I do think data trust in your context, Piru, will need other things before in order for them to work. So yeah.
Yeah, so we've actually been trying to implement how can we do this? So one of the main barriers that we have is that we have a really eclectic group of Indigenous peoples across the region. Everyone speaks a different language, and there is a huge diversity of cultures, but also a real lack of literacy. In a fundamental basic sense, many of the cultures that we're working in may not even have a language that is written. And so it's completely verbal. And the other thing is that the way we structure technology and data systems at the moment is really binary. We separate and disaggregate data and specific thematic fields and data types. And the way Indigenous peoples think about knowledge and knowledge systems is interconnected. And so how do you design a system that captures that in a way that then is reflective of respect of these cultures, but is also reciprocal and evolving over time, like Indigenous peoples' knowledge does, like language does over time? And I think these are the challenges that we're facing at the moment when we're trying to build capacity within Indigenous communities to translate what they already know and their own existing governing structures within their community that is sovereign, if not recognized by national states, but translate that into technology that then can be utilized to be leveraged for their advantage. And not only leveraged for their advantage, but shared to promote things like climate change, sustainability, which is being heavily discussed at the global level at the moment. And so we're taking small pilots at the moment, like small handheld devices, to empower communities to collect their data and then design their own frameworks around how to govern that data amongst themselves, decentralized systems, because the context in Southeast Asia is extremely contentious at the moment on Indigenous issues. And so we're also having to take into consideration security and privacy issues, not only digital, but on a person. And so we're modeling handheld applications that allow them to do this in an offline situation at the moment, and then collectivize that data. What we hope to do is then establish the governing frameworks for this individually among different target communities, and then regionalize that into a more policy approach that can then contribute to like ASEAN's development of data protection policies, which is currently underway. And hopefully the other thing that's needed is the investment into the infrastructure. And I think that is a real large gap at the moment in terms of the way infrastructure is being developed, not only nationally, but also to invest in looking at these alternative models. I shouldn't say alternative, these other more empowering rights-based models on how to manage data.
Thank you, Piru. So many big questions. Asta, I know you want to come in. I just want to say that, please, if you have any questions, put them in the Q&A, and Afrin will moderate it in a second after Asta and her intervention.
I just want wanted to add and like agree with what Piru and Sylvie said. I think that what we're also discovering is this question of, I think like a lot of investment needs to go around organizing and mobilizing people around these questions. And I think Piru referred to it as well, is like, how do we get into the communities and start to coalesce people around questions of data rights? And I think in that context, at least for us in India, and I think in other parts of the world, and I'm not sure if Piru agrees, but like the role of community-based organizations becomes really, really critical. These are organizations that are, and I think this question is sort of, I mean, this is related to one of the questions, is that they are both, you know, morally obligated to work on behalf of the communities, but also very strangely, and in India, become data extractive or part of that data extractive institution, because they're also trying to get services from the state, trying to, you know, like, you know, big tech will come and say like, oh, we're going to put up an internet kiosk, and then this community-based organizations become part of that, you know, exercise as well. So because they make up so much of the last mile delivery in a lot of places in Southeast Asia and in India, I think that their role and their capacity becomes important in the context of data governance. And what we've been discovering in our work, in our conversations with community-based organizations, is that right now, they don't have obviously the capacity, the ability to think about data rights critically, because, you know, data systems are not necessarily evolved, and also moving from just being processes that are part of data collection and moving more to a model of stewardship where they become, you know, representatives, and that the form of those representatives should be decided by the community, whether it's trust, cooperative, etc. But building that capacity or that middle layer, at least to me, seems like an important point of intervention. And like I mentioned, like this is coming up a little bit in policy as well, at least in the context of India with the non-personal data committee. So I think that that's an area that I would be quite interested in burrowing into, is how do we think about last mile capacities for data governance as well.
Thanks, Esther. Over to you, Afrin.
Thanks, Andy. So I already see that literally the questions are being answered in parallel while we are still discussing and summarizing. But I see, Sylvie, you have just managed to answer Ingrid's question. It's pretty interesting to see the question and the way it is framed, specifically on do we need several data trusts serving people with different ideas about data policy? So since you've already tried to put it, Sylvie, do you want to take that first, and then maybe we can...
Sure. So it's a great question. I'm so glad you raised that, because yeah, I didn't have time as always in these presentations. So sometimes people think of data trust as like one behemoth organization. That would be terrible. Why would it be terrible? Well, first, it would give way too much power to one entity. It's very dangerous. But then also, there's no one size fits all. I think it's very dangerous to think that people have the same needs and aspirations when it comes to data and data sharing. So there should be a variety of data trusts, but also data co-ops, data commons that address a variety of needs. So when it comes to data trust, I think it's very important that I'm able to join data trust A that say we want to facilitate data sharing for common goods as much as possible. And then I can join data trust B tomorrow because I've changed in my needs and aspirations, and I'm much more concerned, say, about security, and I want to place more emphasis on security. And so that means there's also more debate then. People, when faced with choice, will start, hopefully, also debating and discussing among themselves what are the priorities, what values trump others when it comes to data sharing. And that's a conversation that's lacking today.
Thanks so much, Sylvie. And maybe Piero, since you already touched upon, you know, the aspects of the process, one part of this question is also interestingly on how can a democratic and legitimate process of representation be organized? So Piero, Astha, do you want to take a pick?
I can go. So I think I think Asta mentioned the last mile, and I do agree and I don't agree. So I agree because I think that there is a critical role in CBOs to be able to represent underprivileged people or people who may not have the capacities or the knowledge to exercise their rights. And building and investing in that interconnectedness is important. And I think the ODI also helps to facilitate a lot of that work in the region with CBOs. But fundamentally, once that capacity is built at the local level, you need to then extract yourself. And that investment in that community and that power and their own ability to exercise their rights and vocalize their needs to then take precedence. And I think that's the transition that needs to happen. That needs to happen in all development settings. But how do you get that representation then on political bodies or investment or then exercise that right within governing structures that really don't recognize you, especially in Southeast Asia where Indigenous rights are not upheld? And that's really, really challenging, but fundamentally they make up a large proportion of the community. And that's why I think if there is a collective movement to start to invest in different ways of managing infrastructure that can leverage Indigenous data sovereignty, and it's always going to be around land and natural resources, it's a huge bargaining chip for them to get on the negotiation table and get voted into political positions to be able to dictate how development and investments are happening within the region. And I think that's how we need to do it. And it needs to be a mass movement. And I agree, there needs to be lots of different models. And this particular model invests in the rights of Indigenous peoples. But there are many displaced peoples that are affected but don't necessarily identify as Indigenous. There's a lot of refugees as well that aren't recognized. And so I think there are lots of different models and approaches here that can be unified in a way then to empower better decision-making around land and natural resources and other social developments that affect the people.
Thanks so much, Piru. In fact, there's another question that has not been answered, but then it's more, I think it was more cross-cutting. I think, Astha, you may be able to pick this because you come from India, and India is almost, we say, the graveyard of pilots, where also a lot of data is being collected. There are various sources. So Palak asked this question on how does these various sources, domains of data influence the act of data governance fundamentally?
Right. I also wanted to say that I agree with Piru, absolutely. I think that the role of community-based organizations is largely a stopgap measure to help, communities get a seat on the table and be part of the decision-making process. And the models that we've discussed, whether it's trusts or cooperatives, enable that mechanism. The question on I guess the way I understand it is that, I agree that there are a lot of organizations that are collecting primary data. And that's what I meant is I think that we need to, obviously there's a question of ethics. And I think a lot of research organizations are beginning to consider that. There's also work that's happening from like sort of top down. The philanthropies that fund these research organizations are creating better mechanisms for both research ethics to be embedded, but also for better data sharing. I think the Wellcome Trust has done this on health research. I think several other, philanthropies like Gates, etc., are thinking of building these data collaboratives so that we don't get into the exercise of just extracting data from communities, building products or whatever research around it, and then, not making sure that this data is then used for the benefit of the community. And I think that we have to think about some of the governance mechanisms that Piru and Sylvie touched upon as well, on how do we make sure that even the research data that's collected by organizations and researchers is something, the decisions on which the community is involved in. So that would be my answer.
Thanks, Astha. So maybe I can then pass on to Andy. I think we just have 1 more minute, and maybe it's a good 1 minute to summarize the webinar. Andy, over to you.
Okay, there was one more question, and Sylvia, maybe you can still answer it on the chat again. This is, kind 10-second statements from each of you. So there's a lot of UNDP colleagues here, and I know they always want sort of concrete advice, sort of what should we do? What is it that we do on the way forward in terms of sort of supporting governments and partners when it comes to data governance initiatives? What's the one thing you would advise them to do? Asta, should we start with you? 10, 15 seconds.
I think it should be about discovery of these models that are coming up in different parts of the world. I think that we've so far seen a lot of models come out of, sort of the quote unquote Western or global North. I think we need to discover what's going on in other parts of the world. And this has been something that we've been trying as well. So UNDP with its like regional position can help uncover some of this, I think.
Excellent. Sylvie or Piero, who wants to go next?
I'll jump in. So first, I just want to quickly say there was a great question on competition between data trusts, which I deleted by mistake. I tried to reply to it. It's a great question because it presses a very important question. Some people worry that data trusts and the competition between them could lead to a race to the bottom, because as long as top-down regulation does not forbid data monetization, then you will have, it's very likely, some data trusts that fund themselves based on a data monetization model where you get a fee or some money back for the sharing of some data. And that is dangerous, no question. The answer is not in the data trust. The answer is in potentially forbidding certain kinds of data monetization for certain kinds of data. So that is an important conversation that needs to be had. There was another question about how trust can be financed. Great question. And I think there should be a mix of privately and publicly funded initiatives. So publicly funded could answer the fact that a lot of people have no awareness of the risks they take when they go online and leak data. And so you could talk about the fact that for people who have no awareness and hence no desire to make a choice when it comes to data trust, you could say, well, just like we've made subscription to a pension fund compulsory because people have a poor understanding of the long-term risks that come with not subscribing to a pension fund, you could say the same logic would apply to a data trust potentially. So that you could say people in Cambridgeshire, for instance, in the absence of choice, get allocated to a data trust that is supervised, and there's oversight mechanism to make sure it doesn't lead to abuse, but to facilitate medical, social care, and education data sharing, for instance. Just in a mouthful, there should be a variety of funding models. Some, and I think these are the most interesting ones, could rely on a kind of service fee model where you say, look, it's a headache to go online every day and navigate all these terms and conditions for a modest fee. If you have enough people in the trust, you could actually say, give me peace of mind, facilitate my data sharing, and I'll pay you, I don't know, 30, 40 pounds a year, let's be optimistic. And that pays for the salary of the data trustee. Yeah, that would be a fantastic model, I think. But
thanks, Sylvie. So you responded to the question and gave some concrete advice to UNDP. Thanks for that. Piero?
I have to fall back on including Indigenous rights into policies. And I think that is fundamentally one of the major things that is lacking. If you don't have governments that recognize Indigenous rights within national policies, even constitutional levels, how can you start to influence policies on the way data governing structures are implemented across the region and the development of infrastructure subsequently? And I think if UNDP, one thing that UNDP could do is mandate policies to include Indigenous voices within policy discussions and development.
Thanks, Piero. So we're taking notes at UNDP. So thanks to the speakers again, to all the participants. Thanks so much. And as I said at the beginning, you'll get the recording so you can watch it again and again. So have a nice day. Thanks so much, everyone. Bye-bye.